whether or not you leave this course remembering all of the ins and outs of Aquinas' philosophy, I think it is important that you understand where he fit in the history of ideas. And so, let's set the stage at where philosophy stood at the beginning of the 13th century. What the status of philosophy was at the beginning of the 13th century. In other words, we're talking about the year 1200. First of all, you must realize that during the intervening centuries, that is the centuries between the death of Augustine and the year 1200, there was enormous confusion about what Plato and Aristotle really believed. There were a number of reasons for that confusion, but certainly one of the reasons was the fact that the writings of these people had been lost. For most of the early Middle Ages, only a few of Plato's writings were in circulation. One of them, incidentally, was the Timaeus. If I remember correctly, the Phaedo lay buried in various libraries in Greek manuscripts, untranslated, inaccessible. The Timaeus had begun to circulate. The condition regarding Aristotle was much the same. Some of Aristotle's logic was known, but much of his writing was unknown. To make things even worse, there were certain ideas of Plotinus that were circulating that people were confusing with Plato and Aristotle. For example, there was a book that was known during the Middle Ages as the Theology of Aristotle, but it was written by Plotinus. It was a section of Plotinus's great work, the Aeneids, that was circulated under the title The Theology of Aristotle. Now you can imagine the confusion that would cause. And so most scholars, those people who thought about philosophy, couldn't really tell you the difference between Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus. Now, some things began to happen in the century before 1200. For one thing, there was many of these ancient writings were recovered and were translated into Arabic. I don't have time here to go into the tremendous scholarship that existed in places like present-day Iran and Iraq, Persia, for example, and then finally in Spain. But during the 10th century and the 11th century and the 12th century, perhaps the greatest scholarship in existence in those centuries was to be found among Muslim thinkers in Arabic cultures. Now, that Muslim or that Arabic philosophy was largely Neoplatonic. And one reason it was Neoplatonic was because of the accessibility of Plotinus's writings and other Neoplatonic writings, and then this aforementioned confusion that existed among various people. But at any rate, one of the first things we find happening about the start of the 1200s is the recovery of Aristotle. Let's say the recovery of a confused Aristotelianism. Because it is an Aristotelianism that is heavily laced with Neoplatonism. A second important event is the rise of the universities. The rise of universities. You see, prior to the 13th century, most significant learning occurred in cathedral schools. Now, what that meant was that this education was heavily controlled by the church. It occurred within a church institution. It occurred under church leadership and teaching in the cathedral schools. As the universities begin to develop and begin to achieve independence, learning will gradually be freed from ecclesiastical control. Now, the universities we're talking about, of course, include Oxford and Cambridge, and the university that's most important for our understanding of Aquinas, the University of Paris. Now, Aquinas taught at the University of Paris for a time. St. Bonaventure taught at the University of Paris. All of these guys studied at some time at Cologne and other schools. Another characteristic, another feature of the 13th century is the rise of religious orders. And two religious orders are particularly important for our purposes, and that is the Franciscan order and the Dominican order. There will be no Jesuits for several centuries more. The Dominicans and the Franciscans pretty much ran the ball game during the 13th and 14th centuries. The Franciscans were primarily Augustinian. Whatever Aristotelianism you can find in a Franciscan thinker, it's an Aristotelianism that simply modifies a more basic Platonism, a more basic Augustinianism. The major Franciscan father was Saint Bonaventure. The major Franciscan school of higher education in America today happens to be St. Bonaventure University, down near Olean, New York. The Dominican order soon was championed by Thomas Aquinas. Please spell Aquinas correctly. There is no C anywhere in Aquinas' name. It's A-Q-U-I-N-A-S. Now, there were earlier Dominicans, there would be later Dominicans, but Thomas is clearly the chief Dominican thinker. And what we find in the Dominican order is a primary drift in the direction of Aristotle's philosophy, with some minor additions of Neoplatonism and Augustinianism. So, the Franciscan order, primarily Augustinian with a little bit of Aristotelianism. The Dominican order, primarily Aristotelian with a little bit of, with a few concessions to Augustine and Plato. Now, one other thing I'm going to mention, a couple of other things. The important role of translations. For the first time in the Middle Ages, translations of Plato and Aristotle become available. But this translation business is tricky. Let's take a typical work of Aristotle, for example. The history of its translation went like this: from Greek to Arabic to Latin. The Latin translations of Aristotle that began to circulate in the 13th century and a little bit before were not translations directly from the Greek. They were translations directly from the Arabic translations that these Muslim scholars had been using for decades. Only later would scholarship advance to the point where they could get beyond the Arabic and actually produce translations of Aristotle from the original Greek. Now we're ready for our problem. The Catholic Church at the beginning of the 13th century became convinced that Christian Aristotelianism was heretical. It became convinced that Aristotle's philosophy could not be useful at all for Christians who wished to be faithful to Catholic orthodoxy. Now, there were three beliefs in particular that bothered Catholic authorities. Perhaps here I should mention a debate. In the year 1210, the Provincial Council of Paris forbade the public or the private teaching of Aristotle's natural philosophy. You taught Aristotle's natural philosophy under pain of severe punishment, under threat of excommunication. Now, it's important to understand why this prohibition against Aristotle was made. Remember my earlier claim about that Aristotle's thought had become confused with Neoplatonism. Well, this is the reason for the trouble. I'm going to give you the name of the major Arabic philosopher of the Middle Ages. There were lots of others, but this guy is the one whose name you should remember. It was Averroes. I think that's the proper pronunciation. Averroes lived from 1126 to 1198. In other words, he died just before our crucial century begins. Averroes was born in Spain. Now, there were three doctrines in particular that Averroes taught as being part of Aristotle's philosophy. First of all, no personal immortality. Secondly, no creation of the world. And I'll tell you the third one in a moment. But let's just focus on these two. Now, just between us, Aristotle did teach the eternity of the world, all right? But the fact is that Averroes was still confusing Aristotle and Plotinus. So that when Averroes talked about the origin of the world, he did it as Plotinus did, as a kind of eternal emanation, overflow of the being of God. Think back to my little diagram about Plotinus. So the world is eternal for Averroes. Secondly, think back to my account of Plotinus's view of nous. Remember? There is one all-embracing cosmic nous, and then as ontological extensions of that one cosmic nous, every other intelligence or mind in the universe is a kind of emanation or overflow from that. Remember my umbrella, my inverted umbrella with the extensions like this? And then remember, I told you that for Plotinus, when a person dies, that person's nous is simply reabsorbed back into the cosmic nous, which means that that person loses all identity in whatever future existence there might be. In other words, there is no such thing as personal survival, personal immortality after death. Aristotle denied the creation of the world. We don't really know what Aristotle believed on personal immortality, but Averroes is operating here in a Neoplatonic scheme. Now, these two beliefs are not only inconsistent with Christian teaching, they are also inconsistent with Muslim teaching. If any Christian taught these two things, he'd be attacked as a heretic. Averroes was attacked as a Muslim heretic. He was in deep trouble. And so Averroes came up with a clever answer to all of the mullahs, who were accusing him of heresy. It's the theory of double truth. What Averroes meant here was simply this. a proposition could be true in philosophy, but its contradictory proposition could be true in theology. And so, when Averroes was challenged as being a heretic, he would say, well, you have to distinguish between what I teach as a philosopher and what I believe as a faithful Muslim. As a faithful Muslim, I believe there is personal immortality. As a good philosopher, I believe there is no personal immortality, and both of those propositions are true at the same time and in the same sense. How do you like that? He might have had a job at Westminster Theological Seminary. Who knows? I'm just kidding. But that's the Muslim world. But watch what happens next. This philosophy moves in one single package to the University of Paris. Remember now, the University of Paris is relatively free of church control, of ecclesiastical control, and somewhat like, well, I guess the situation would be analogous to Baylor University, which used to be a Southern Baptist college, but which has suddenly told Southern Baptists to go fly a kite. They're declaring their independence. Of course, for years, the faculty at Baylor haven't believed much of anything anyway. I don't know why they continue to get Southern Baptist money, but they've finally gone public. We're no longer going to be Southern Baptists. We're going to take the billion-dollar campus that you people paid for. Thank you very much. And we're now going to teach whatever we want, which means that we're going to deny the Christian faith if necessary. Well, this is what happened at the University of Paris. The major figure at the University of Paris was a man whose name has never been a household word, Siger of Brabant. I'm looking for my dates here. You're right. Am I right? His name is not a household word. But nonetheless, he's kind of important here, if I can get his dates. But I'm probably not going to find it. Anyway, he died around Siger of Brabant. Siger was the leader of a group of people called the Latin Averroists. What that means is they were full-fledged Averroists teaching in Latin, teaching in a Christian context, which meant that here were so-called Christians teaching Aristotle in such a way that they denied the creation of the world, and they denied personal immortality, and for that reason, this teaching was condemned in 1210. But when Siger was accused of being a heretic, he also affirmed the theory of double truth. He said, Your Holiness, you don't understand. The life of a philosopher is a hard life. And so as a philosopher, I am required to believe things that I renounce when I talk theology. So, it is true in philosophy that the world is eternal, but it is true in theology that God created the world. It's what we call doublespeak, all right? Now, this is the picture of what faced Aquinas when he came on the scene. We are now ready to begin talking about Aquinas. Aquinas was like a comet. This guy was born in 1225. He died in 1274. He died before he reached the age of 50. And yet in that span of 49 years, only 15 of which he could have been at his peak of powers, he wrote 30 large volumes. It's incredible. Now, what Aquinas wanted to do, and you got to realize this, he wanted to rescue Aristotle for Christian philosophy. That was his objective. He wanted to develop a system of Christian philosophy based upon Aristotle's thought. But in order to do that, he had to eliminate all of these problems and challenges that confronted him. And so, what I guess the best way to understand Aristotle is to see him as a man with a mission. And he really did not care if the fulfillment of that mission always meant that he spoke the truth. He was a propagandist. He would play some games. He would pull some tricks. He would pull out some exegesis of these philosophers that wasn't always kosher, because he was in a battle and he meant to win that battle. All right, now, as I proceed my exposition of Aristotle, or Aquinas, and we're not going to finish it today, but we'll get more than halfway through, I think. I want you to look and see how Aristotle handles the problem of personal immortality. In fact, you might expect this as a kind of essay question sometime between now and Christmas, all right? How did Aristotle, in his attempt to rescue Aristotle's thought from these problems, how did he eliminate the problems connected with the personal immortality, the creation of the world, and double truth? Well, let's focus first of all on this business of double truth. And here I'm relying on the book, the discussion in The Word of God on the Mind of Man, page 109 through 111. Let's remember the positions that were available to people in Paris in the early 13th century. First of all, there were people who thought like this. There were people who said, whenever there is a conflict between pagan philosophy and revealed truth, I will always go with pagan philosophy. I will always put philosophy over theology. We could call those the liberals of the day, because that's what liberals have always done in Protestantism. Whenever there's been any apparent struggle between Christianity, the faith, the revealed Word of God, and anything else, science, evolution, philosophy, they've always put Scripture second. But then there would be another group in that day, and they would say, and these were the Catholics who excommunicated these Aristotelians. There were people in that day who said, we will always go with the Scriptures, and we will always renounce Aristotle. Whenever there's a conflict, we will always put faith first and philosophy second. I suppose we could call those people the fundamentalists of their day, all right? In any struggle between faith and reason, if there was any conflict, it never bothered them to discount reason, philosophy, Aristotle, and go with faith. But then there were the Siggers of Brabant who had this double theory of truth. We could call them the dialectical or neo-orthodox theologians of their day. I'm serious here. Sigger of Brabant was a 13th century Paul Tillich. If you read Paul Tillich's book, The Dynamics of Faith, you'll find Tillich teaching a double theory of truth. Look it up sometime. In other words, Tillich says, what I believe in religion may be false for the historian, may be false for the scientist, but it's true for me in my inward religious belief. Something can be true in religion and false in philosophy or history or science. Paul Tillich is a 20th century Latin Averroist. But there's one other position out there for us. There were the liberals, there were the fundamentalists, there were the dialectical thinkers of their time, and then there was Aquinas. Now, I want to give Aquinas credit. He had no use for this double theory of truth. No use for it at all. He took whatever other fudging went on in his thought, he took an uncompromising stand and said this: God is the author of all truth, and whenever you find inconsistency, you are in the presence of error. So it is my task as a Christian philosopher not to pretend that contrary truths don't exist. It's my task as a philosopher to sort things out and discover what the one truth is. And Aquinas would even go so far as to say this: if Aristotle contradicts the Christian faith, and I can't refute Aristotle, then I'm going to admit that on that point the Christian faith is wrong. I'm certainly not going to take this crazy double truth idea and say, well, it can be true for Aristotle, but the opposite can be true in my Sunday school class. So let's give Aquinas credit. He took an uncompromising stand for the unity of truth. God is the author of all truth, that which is revealed in Scripture, that which is revealed in that which is discovered by science. And so if there is an apparent contradiction, we'd either better eliminate that contradiction, or we'd better assent to the truth wherever it is. Okay. Now, the first element of Aquinas' philosophy that we're going to look at is his epistemology. And I'm going to focus on two features of his epistemology. First of all, his view of faith and reason. Aquinas' view of faith and reason. Now, there's a difference between Aquinas and Augustine here, my friends. A minor difference. Well, I don't know if it's so minor. Let's see what it is. First of all, Aquinas said, faith and reason must be logically compatible. Faith and reason must be logically compatible. Now, what that means is precisely what I just said a few moments ago. Faith and reason can never contradict each other in God's universe. If what God has revealed in the Bible is true, and it is, and Aquinas believed in the truth of the Bible, then that truth will always be consistent with what we find in God's created universe. Any contradictions can only be apparent. They can never be real. What we learn from faith, what we learn from reason, must be logically compatible. But now, and that's incidentally something that Augustine would agree with. Augustine would say yes to that. I hope you say yes to that. But now on the second point, we find a new position on faith and reason emerging, and that is this: faith and reason are psychologically, notice, we're not talking about logic, we're talking about psychology. They are psychologically incompatible. Now this will require a little explanation. What Aquinas means is that if you know something by faith, then you do not also, in that instance, know the same thing by reason. Gordon Clark, who has done some really good stuff on this in which of his books? Religion, Reason, and Revelation is the book by Clark that I'm thinking about. Gordon Clark identifies Aquinas' position here under the heading faith or reason. And what the disjunct or draws our attention to is the fact that these are two different avenues to knowledge. These are two different approaches to knowledge, such that if you know something by faith, then you don't know it by reason. If you know it by reason, then it is not a matter of faith for you. These are psychologically disparate functions of the soul, or avenues of knowledge. But now, of course, I have to do something else. I have to tell you what faith and reason mean for Aquinas. Maybe I should have done that earlier. The words faith and reason for Aquinas are simply synonyms for theology and philosophy. The object of faith is revelation, which means what we can only know from God, which we can only get from God, and the systematization of the content of revelation gives us theology. Reason, however, is what we can know on our own. Let's call it experience. Notice here, the word reason is not the complement of the word experience for Aquinas. For Aquinas, what he calls reason actually has its starting point in human experience, and the systematization of human experience gives us philosophy. Now, of course, there's still one other way to put this. Reason for Aquinas simply means Aristotle. And faith for Aquinas simply means the revelation that God has given in the Bible and in the teachings of the Catholic Church. We mustn't forget that Aquinas is now, we're now fully into Roman Catholicism. This is the late Middle Ages now. So, faith, what we know in the Bible and in God's revelation through the teachings of the Church, versus Aristotle's philosophy. A couple of other points. Aristotle believes that these are two God-given methods which eventually we will need both of them. In one way, you can picture Aquinas' view of faith and reason by using the analogy of two different step ladders. Okay? The lower step ladder, which, remember, has its beginning in human observation and experience, which we then reflect on, which we think about, which we systematize, that is philosophy. But, of course, keep in mind that it also includes science. Let's put science here in parentheses. This is whatever we can know by ourselves. Now, in a sense, what Aquinas is saying is not that absurd. He is pointing out the fact that we come to know a great deal of things about the world on the basis of our own observation and experience. How do we know that certain mushrooms cause great gastric distress and may kill? By experience. Nothing in the Bible that tells you don't eat these mushrooms. How do we know which gas works best for our car? Mushrooms gas, well, I'm talking about a different kind of gas, obviously. We learn it by experience. How do we know where the North Pole is? Through experience. All right, so whether you call it science or history or philosophy, philosophy being the general word that covers all of this, our own human powers, our own human cognitive powers can take us a long way in our search for knowledge. In fact, I'll tell you how far they can take us. They can take the highest truth that can be established by human reason alone is the proposition God exists. Aquinas believes that there are philosophical proofs that are adequate to demonstrate the existence of the Christian God. That's the highest truth that can be proven by philosophy. But if you want to go beyond that truth, you have to switch stepladders. You have to get off the ladder of reason and you have to start climbing the ladder of faith. So we can illustrate that this way. Here we are at the mercy of a special revelation. This is faith. This is revelation. This is theology. There are some important truths that human reason cannot demonstrate. Somebody says, give me an example. All right, Aquinas says, I will. That God is a Trinity. Philosophy is of no help in proving the triune nature of God. We know that solely and exclusively on the basis of divine revelation. From the Bible, from the teaching of the church. Certain other truths about the nature of God are available to us only on the basis of faith. Now watch the next point. If you're asleep, slap your face because this is important. I've already erased it from the board. Remember, I told you to watch out for how Aquinas handled the creation of the world. Remember? Here's the punchline for that. Aquinas says philosophy and science cannot settle the question, did the world have a beginning in time? Philosophy is powerless to settle that question. It is not a matter for philosophy then at all. It is totally and exclusively a matter of faith. Now that's how Aquinas extricated Aristotle from that embarrassing problem. In other words, Aquinas said to the anti-Aristotelian Catholics of his day, it wasn't so much that Aristotle was wrong as it was he tried to solve a non-philosophical question in the wrong way. In other words, he sort of neutralized Aristotle's mistake. Clever move. Now, over on the other side of town, there was another Catholic philosopher named St. Bonaventure. I've already told you that Bonaventure was a member of what religious order? The Franciscans. You already know then that Bonaventure is going to be more influenced by Augustine than he is by Aristotle. Well, what we begin to see here is the first of a number of disagreements between the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Bonaventure believed that philosophy could prove that the world had a beginning in time. And so Bonaventure offered arguments in support of the claim, the Christian belief in creation. Earlier this semester, we talked about J.P. Moreland's book, Scaling the Secular City, or whatever, his apologetics book, in which why am I having so much trouble with names here? J.P. Moreland, right, offers an argument in support of the creation of the world, that is, the impossibility of an infinite series, that has some affinities. I'm not sure it's exactly the same argument that Bonaventure developed, but it's an argument in the same spirit, that you cannot have an infinitely long period of time, an infinitely long creation preceding the present moment. That an infinite series, in other words, is impossible. Well, so much for Aquinas' view of faith and reason. One other fact about his epistemology, and then we'll move to another aspect of his thought. My board here is getting a little messed up. Let's make this point B. Aquinas was an empiricist. Oh, dear. Oh, me. You know, what do you do when your daughter comes, you know, you're 40 years old, your daughter comes home from college and she says, Daddy, I'm going to marry an empiricist. You know, what a tragedy. You know, what do you do at a time like that? Well, we shouldn't be surprised because Aristotle was the father of empiricism. Earlier this semester, I gave you a definition of empiricism. Remember what that definition was? Empiricism is the belief that all human knowledge has its origin in sense experience. Remember this stuff over here? This first ladder, this lower ladder, the ladder of reason, builds upon information that we receive through our observation of the world. Now, you have in your textbook, Thales to Dewey, a typical Gordon Clark chapter in which he goes to work on Aquinas. If you've read that chapter carefully, you know, I think that may be the most powerful. I realize much of it may not be always understandable. I think that's the most powerful and damaging criticism of Aquinas' philosophy that you will find anywhere. The whole system hinges on that empiricism, and it eventually, even though it's a beautiful system, it eventually cracks apart because empiricism simply isn't strong enough to hold up the superstructure of the system. Well, we'll pass on we'll leave the empiricism go for now, and we'll see how that question fits in a little later on. Let me move now from Aquinas' epistemology. We always get a little weary about 4:30, don't we? First 2 hours are all right, but I'll tell you, that third hour, but that's okay. We're going to learn what it means to survive here. Let's talk, secondly, about Aquinas' psychology. Now, there are lots of little details here that we could pursue if we had more time, but there's one point in particular that I want to stress, and that is how Aquinas handled the problem of personal immortality. That's what I want to handle here. Remember, there were three beliefs that resulted in Aristotle's thought being condemned by the Catholic Church. The theory of double truth. How did Aquinas handle that? By rejecting it. By saying that's not essential, that's not germane. That a good Catholic Aristotelian is going to believe that all truth is one. The second problem was the creation of the world. How did Aquinas handle that? By saying that Aristotle overestimated the powers of human reason and falsely arrived at a conclusion which philosophy cannot possibly demonstrate. And so the Christian Aristotelian sadly admits that Aristotle was wrong, and the Christian Aristotelian recognizes on the basis of his faith in special divine revelation that God created the world in time. But now what are we going to do about personal immortality? Well, if you will go back to the earlier lecture and the earlier passage in Christianity in the Hellenistic world, where I talked about the three interpretations of Aristotle's active intellect. Remember that? I hope you do. It's in the second chapter of the Hellenistic World book. I told you that there were three different interpretations of Aristotle's active intellect that came to be developed during the Middle Ages. Incidentally, I've discovered on rereading Clark here, and this is the first time that I can ever recall saying this, that Clark and I disagree in our interpretation of something. I think Clark's handling of the active intellect is confused. and I feel uncomfortable saying that. I think Clark confuses some things that I think are spelled out correctly in the Hellenistic World Book. But remember that I pointed out to you that the active intellect was said by some people to be God. And I equated that interpretation with Augustine. I think it's this interpretation that leads to Augustine's theory of divine illumination. In other words, there is a light, God, that illumines every human mind, and that light is independent of our minds. Our minds simply are created reflections of the divine light, and so that's what the active intellect is on this view. It is the separate creator God who exists independently of our minds and who shines out his light upon us and makes knowledge possible. The second interpretation of the active intellect was the cosmic nous of Plotinus. The cosmic nous of Plotinus. In other words, as you now know, that which is eternal and separable and without which nothing thinks, a quotation from Aristotle, turns out in Plotinus's analysis of things to refer again to something that exists over and above individual human minds. It's a kind of cosmic mind. It's the mind of God. It's this cosmic nous. And so that's where we get into our problem about personal immortality. The individual nous at death simply becomes once again a part of the cosmic nous. Here's what Aquinas does. He comes up with a third and different interpretation. He rejects Augustine's view. He rejects Plotinus's view. In other words, what he says to the church is, this isn't Aristotle's fault, this is Plotinus's fault. It's Plotinus that's the heretic. It's Averroes who's the heretic. It's not Aristotle. So Aquinas goes into the text, the actual text of Aristotle's book on psychology, and he points to this very same passage that talks about the active intellect, this very same passage that says that knowledge is possible because of an active intellect which is separable and eternal. And Aquinas says there, Aristotle believed that every human being has something immortal within him. Here's the chapter and verse, see? This is a brilliant display of propaganda. This is a brilliant move. In one little swoop like that, Aquinas delivers Aristotle from this last taint of heresy by arguing that when Aristotle is read correctly, he believed in personal immortality. Now, most Catholic philosophers today will admit that that is lousy exegesis. Read Frederick Copleston, for example, who's a very fair Roman Catholic historian of philosophy. He was himself a Thomist. But he admits this is lousy exegesis. Aristotle didn't believe in personal immortality at all. But that doesn't matter because Aquinas won the day. See? Aquinas convinced the people that counted that his was the correct interpretation of Aristotle. So, by now, many of the major problems are taken care of. He's gotten rid of the creation of the world problem by making it a matter exclusively of faith. He's gotten rid of the personal immortality problem by reading Aristotle in a new way. Well, let's see how much farther we can get. We have 25 minutes left. Let's turn next then. Let's see if there are any questions. I've covered a lot of material. Let's take some questions first. Way in the back.
If you're looking at this faith and reason, would Aquinas then say that revelation is experiential?
Yeah, Aristotle, or Aquinas rather, wouldn't deny that God's revelation comes to us through experience, which is what you would expect an empiricist to say, right? In other words, God revealed certain truths to Paul through Paul's special religious experience. Same way with Peter. And the same way through God's guiding the Catholic Church in the formulation of dogma over the centuries and so on. So yeah, we don't want to disassociate the faith up here from its grounding in experience either, in religious experience. Yeah.
Was Aquinas interested in so-called rescuing the philosophy of Aristotle from the empiricism, or what was his back?
All right. The question is, was Aquinas' interest in rescuing Aristotle related in any way to his desire to develop a kind of empiricism? No doubt that was a part of it. I think the full picture would be something like this. Aquinas simply saw in Aristotle the kind of competing system to Plato and to Plotinus that he thought had the best possibilities for the Catholic Church. Okay? It just, I mean, if you're looking at available systems at that time, there aren't many options, and Aquinas just didn't want to give up on Aristotle. He thought there was too much potential there. Yeah.
Connected to that, when you've spoken a lot about the motivation of Aquinas here, and I was wondering what kind of evidence points to the fact that it looks like the saving of Aristotle was more important than the truth of anything within the matter.
Okay, in other words, you're pointing out the fact that I've been engaged in some psychologizing. I have been...
You've almost painted the picture as, in some respects, you've been a dishonest man.
I painted the picture that he might be, in some respects, a dishonest man. The reason I'm repeating that is for the tape. The word dishonest would be too strong. I don't want to imply that, but I do want to clearly convey the fact that this is a man who had a mission. All right? And sometimes people can put a spin on things that might fall short of being dishonest, even though it is. You ever watched a White House press conference, for example? All right. Is that... That's the fallacy of equivocation. I'm not endorsing this. Who said, is this a kind of... I'm not encouraging you to do this. I'm simply describing what Aquinas did. He thought it was imperative to rescue Aristotle from this problem. And he did some things that weren't, I think, entirely kosher. All right? So, but, you know, I'm not going to take his sainthood away from him or anything like that. Yes.
I don't see where he was important. I don't see what his strength was.
Well, I'll tell you one reason why he was important. One reason Aquinas is important is because in the year 1870 something or other, 1877, I forget exactly which year, in the late 19th century, the Pope of the day issued an edict that said, henceforth, all Roman Catholic philosophy must be done in the spirit of St. Thomas. In other words, if from this day forward you are a teacher of philosophy in a Roman Catholic institution anywhere in the world, and you disagree with Thomas, you're going to lose your job. It's hard to remember a day when the Catholic Church fired people for teaching heresy, isn't it? I should have gotten a bigger laugh on that than I did. Catholic Church doesn't fire people for teaching anything these days, frankly, although the Pope would like to do it. That's why Aquinas is so important. For about 100 years, his system of thought dominated Roman Catholic philosophy and theology. That's no longer the case. Today, Catholics have become so uppity that they don't want to be associated with Thomas Aquinas. The mark of an educated Catholic today, a liberal educated Catholic today, is that he's an anti-Thomist. You got to watch these uppity Catholics. They're about as bad as uppity Baptists. Yes.
I've read the book G.K. Chesterton on Aquinas, and he would make the strong argument, and he painted an entirely different picture of Aquinas, and he would say the total opposite, that Luther took the Christian faith out of intellectualism and brought it back into
A fideistic position.
yeah, and he would argue, and he would also say that it wasn't that they did it by default, but that the church recognized him as the doctor over Augustine, actually.
Well, G.K. Chesterton is a British thinker who was committed to Catholic orthodoxy in the early years of the 20th century. Yeah, but it seems to me that analysis ignores the extent to which Aquinas was ignored by his own Catholic Church for several centuries. Okay? The fact that Aquinas' thought was institutionalized as the official Catholic philosophy in the late 19th century was not a reflection of the status quo for the previous 2 or 3 centuries. It was a command for Catholics to get back to what that particular pope regarded as basic Catholic philosophy. So I think Chesterton's being a little unfair to Luther. He's also ignoring the several centuries in there when listen, Aquinas was himself condemned twice after his death. His many propositions in his system were condemned in the year 1277 by the Catholic Church. Okay, so
The strength that he was making about Aquinas was not totally as a reactionist or avarice. He was just, that was the foundation. The main thrust was that he was a philosopher who was able to now incorporate all truth.
That's a little, I like Chesterton, but I think that's a little bit naive. There was a game going on here, there was a game in town, and Aquinas did a masterful job of playing it. What Aquinas did, listen, is somewhat similar to what Gorbachev is doing right now in the Soviet Union. He's introducing capitalism, but he's saying this is neo-Marxism. Well, let me tell you about, let me turn our attention to metaphysics, and we'll get into the business of angels, all right? I know you've been waiting breathlessly for this. Now, I am not going to go into the details of Thomistic metaphysics, except to say that there are hardly any deviations from Aristotle's metaphysics. There are a few, and they're important deviations, but for the most part, what Aquinas does is simply take over Aristotle's form-matter doctrine and use it as the basis for his explanation of the world. In other words, everything is a combination of form and matter. And so, if you look at Aquinas, you'll have the doctrine of the 4 causes. Remember, the formal cause, material cause, efficient cause. You'll have the doctrine of the 10 categories. You'll have all of that stuff with these exceptions. And now I want to bring St. Bonaventure back into the picture. Remember Bonnie? St. Bonaventure over here and Aquinas over here. Even though Bonaventure was an Augustinian, I told you that he had some Aristotelianism floating around in his system. Well, Bonaventure believed that the form-matter distinction applied even in the cases of angels and the human soul, even in the case of spiritual beings. And so Bonaventure believed that angels were form plus matter, and the human soul is form plus matter. The human soul is form plus matter. It's a little embarrassing that Bonaventure on this point is closer to Aristotle than Aquinas is. But Aquinas believed that angels are pure form. Angels are pure form. Now I know that some of you can barely constrain your excitement at this point. Angels are pure form, but I want you to see the consequences of this. I didn't talk about this so much when we dealt with Aristotle, but Aristotle believed that the basis of individuation, oh, I hate to dump this on you, the basis of individuation lies in matter. In other words, we have all of these chairs in this room, and they all possess the same form, but what makes this chair an individually different chair from this one? Aristotle's answer, the fact that they have different matter. They both share the same form, chairness, but they have different matter. The matter of this chair is different from the matter of this chair. Hence, this chair is individually different from this one. All right? So what makes... all of us in this room share the form of humanness. We all share the form of humanity. But what makes us different is our matter. My body's here, your body's there, all right? Well. Now, because Bonaventure believed that angels are form plus matter, he could believe that there can be more than one angel to a species. Put that in your notes. Share that with your spouse tonight. Write your mother a letter. That if angels are matter plus form, there can be more than one angel to a species. But on Aquinas' view, because angels have no matter, there is nothing to individuate one angel from another within the same species. Hence, for Aquinas, there can only be one angel to a species, friend. Now, I'm laughing about this, but these guys thought this was serious stuff. You know? They were ready to start new denominations over this business. How many angels to a species? Now, what this means is, now, you see, I don't know what the word... there are lots of cherubim in the Bible. There are lots of seraphim in the Bible. So there must... cherubim and seraphim, oh, this is silly. Can't be names for particular angelic species, but whatever the species, angelic species are, there can only be one to a group. Now, you've all heard about the business, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, all right? Incidentally, nobody knows where that comes from. I don't think anybody has ever found that in any printed text, so it may just be a fiction. Maybe Jerry Falwell made it up. I don't know. Nobody knows. But that problem, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, is certainly relevant to the distinction between the dispute between Bonaventure and Aquinas here. If angels have no matter, then you can have all the angels dancing on the head of a pin you want, see? Because there's nothing material, no matter there. And I guess that Bonaventure would be committed to saying that only one angel can sit on a pin at a time. I don't know. Now, this business about angels is somewhat relevant because Aquinas has come down to us in history under a special name. All of these great medieval philosophers had special names. I think Bonaventure was called the seraphic doctor. Well, Aquinas was called the angelic doctor. Not because of his temperament or his personality. He was called the angelic doctor because of his great interest in angels. And because of his interest in angels, he developed an argument for the existence of angels that I guess I'm going to share with you. All right? In other words, what Aquinas did, this is why he was the angelic doctor. He noticed that there were levels to reality. For example, on the physical realm, the level below man, on the physical realm, we have a reality that is material, it's matter, it's finite, it's created, and it is non-spiritual. There's no spirit. This would be true of rocks and trees. It would be true of dogs. It would be true of Shamu, the killer whale. He's He's created, it's finite, it's material, there's no spirit, no soul there, all right? Then we come to man, and what we find is that man is matter, he is finite, he is created, but he is also spirit or soul. So here we have the difference between man and the level of reality below man. Then, of course, there's God, who is no matter, who is infinite, who is uncreated, and spirit. But then Aquinas said, look at the chart. There's too big a gap between here and here. Surely it makes sense to believe in the possibility of a sphere of being that is no matter, that is finite, that is created spirit. And what else could that missing level of reality be other than angels? So he actually produces a kind of philosophical argument for the possibility of angelic beings, see? If there weren't angels, there'd be this big gap in reality, and God is too rational a God to leave that kind of gap. So, since angels are possible, and since they're taught by divine revelation, and since even Aristotle talked about these intermediary beings, why not believe in angels? Hence he is called the angelic doctor. All right, any questions about that? Yes?
Could you repeat a little bit?
In the discussion of the angels being pure form and there being no individual species, but you can have many angels.
Yes, there can be well, I don't know that there are
Not many individual angels?
That means that if there are 2,333 individual angels, there are 2,333 species of angels. Okay? For every single angel, there must be a different species. Why? Because of this form matter nonsense. That's why.